When the invitation came from Indonesia to present ideas of conflict resolution and using bioethics as a paradigm, I started looking at bioethics from a very different angle. My work has been in Islamic ethics and universal ethics in comparative ethics, as I have worked for the last 40 years in the environment of University of Virginia and now George Mason University. With colleagues, we have developed comparative ethics as much as comparative bioethics. We teach a course together on taking human life in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So we have developed what we call a search for very sustainable discussions of bioethics. As we all know that bioethics is a new subject in the Muslim world. I have been working in Iran and Iraq for the last 10 years to develop bioethics as a course and a bioethics as a degree program. And we have now identified the pedagogy as much as the methodology that should go to train new bioethicists in the Muslim world. In general, I must say that I agree with the speaker who spoke earlier about the lack of ethical training in the Muslim world in general. And there isn't a subject that is being taught even in the seminaries as Islamic ethics the way we should be teaching that course, because I understand from developing a course in Islamic ethics that it is more than Aristotelian virtue ethics. It is the ethics which teaches us to reason about good and evil, good and bad, and make choices through moral reasoning in what we do. Today's topic is then, in my humble search, my thesis is that ethics is very much committed to improve human relationships at all levels of human relationships. Could be political, could be social, economical, it could even be personal. And as we move along in the global society, one of the things that you and I find is very difficult to sustain is the ethics of human relationship. How do we relate to one another? What are the basic issues for us to relate to one another? In my 20 years of search, I have been able to identify what we call the universal and particular discourse of bioethics. The book that I wrote on Islamic biomedical ethics took me 10 years to be as inclusive as possible, because it deals with the 5 Muslim schools of thought, 4 Sunni schools of thought and 1 Shia school of thought. So it is, in a way, an inclusive attempt to understand what the religious theology, what is the legal ethics teaching the Muslims, and how they make decisions. And now we have been able to separate the area of Sharia studies and bioethics a little bit, because it was always believed that bioethics is the study of the fatwa literature, the fatwa that the ulama are giving in Al-Azhar and other centers of learning. But now we are learning that no, there is even a universal language that is available to the Muslim ethicist as much as Jewish ethicists, Christian ethicists, to talk to one another at the level that secular bioethics allows internationally, under WHO, under United Nations, to speak to one another. So I have participated in the several what we call international conferences in Pakistan and other places, and Iran, to create that kind of dialogical methodology in the study of bioethics. after all, if medical technology is universal, then the medical issues and clinical issues that arise are also universal. And we need to somehow talk about phenomenal advancement in medicine, which have created a kind of need to talk to one another across borders. So we are not only talking about the telemedicine, which is, now consultation that can take place across the nations, across the hospitals, across the health providers, but we are also talking about the possibility of creating a conglomerate, a consortium of the ethicists who are concerned to help the patients to face this difficult moments of suffering, difficult moments of clinical decision making. And there is this humanistic aspect which makes us very much connected with one another. What the modern, I think, medicine needs to do is to connect people with one another, not only professionally, but also at the interpersonal level. And that's what we are searching for. So when I look at the conflict resolution, and I must admit in a very humble way that I am also a marriage counselor in the United States. I am also a counselor between parents and children conflicts. I am also a counselor in the intra-faith and interfaith relationships. I work with Bishops' Committee in Catholic ethics as much as the Catholic interfaith relations. In other words, I bring into focus all my activities. I'm not locked up in ivory tower of university. I'm involved in the community. I don't just sit in my office and create knowledge about bioethics, but I also work in the hospital as a chaplain. I am a chaplain in the University of Virginia healthcare system, and I go and visit the sick patients across faiths. I not only see Muslim patients, but I also see Christian, Jewish, and even atheist patients, those who don't believe in any religion. So I bring into my search several levels of my practical education. I don't have a degree in bioethics as such, but as a student of bioethics, we were required to go to medical school at the University of Virginia to study for 1 year all medical terminology, so that we understand the way we speak to medical professionals. So we have now ethics committee, not only in the United States, which has been a long tradition, but also in Iran, which never knew that there was ethics committee in the hospital, where the ethics committee needs to work on the solutions to provide between family and the professionals and the family and the patient. All this is part of the dynamics, the new dynamics that is demanding today more than a degree in bioethics or more than a degree in MD or other fields of sciences. We need to touch human beings as human beings. How shall we do it? So, I can move this, right? What I am also very conscious about is when you speak to WHO, administrators of the World Health Organization, they seem to be insisting on the secular bioethics and the secular principles of bioethics. They have neglected, I would say, and they are also demeaning to the religious ethics as such, because it is their idea that only secularism can speak across communities. What I'm going to argue today is that in conflict resolution and peace building, we need to keep in mind that we need to be inclusive of religious communities together. Now, what I'm searching for is that although my paradigm is religious, but the religious paradigm is very much connected with the secular paradigm. Human beings are endowed with fitra, with innate disposition. What Augustine would say, the natural law. People are endowed with natural law, natural capacity. And I can say that across the nations, across the communities, it is true that we are endowed in ability to judge goodness of things, knowing causes of things, perfecting the self to reflect divine nature, the nature that we are talking about. And attaining freedom through submission to the divine will, I'm talking from the religious point of view, it might not be divine will for those who don't believe in it, but it could very well be the common good of all humanity. How exactly are we going to achieve it? How shall we move in that direction? So there is already, although we tend to think that religions are very particularistic and made very exclusionary, which is true, by the way. All religious communities think in a very exclusive sense, and yet there is, within religious communities, it's like Christian ethics is built around love thy neighbor as you love thyself. That's the foundation of Christian ethics. And you find similar ideas in all other religions are available. Even in Hinduism, you might find that there are issues and there are ideals that are projected by the Hindu ethics in a way how to deal with other human beings. And this is not surprising at all, because people have always lived together. And I think that when you move on to the idea of universal secular traditions, is this okay? Right. The next one, please. Okay. Now, what the role of faith does in a society, society like Indonesia, where there are people, where the culture is religious, and I do make a very conscious effort of separating the culture in some ways from religious, cultural and religious. And I think that cultural sensitivity requires to understand people's religiosity. They might not be truly religious, and yet religion plays a role in their decision making. So we find that, I think that the potentiality with which God has created human beings, and human beings being perfectible, we find that faith in God is a positive element rather than a negative one. We tend to be in the West, we tend to downplay what faith does. And I know, working in the hospital environment, that's what you are trained as a first requirement for any chaplain, is to play down your religious particularity and try to become as universal. And it is also the qualitative difference between life or without God consciousness that we are talking about, and how people are encouraged to think about such matters. And I think this is the beautiful tradition in Islamic tradition, man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. The one who knows oneself knows also the divine. Knowledge of the self leads to the realm of images and visions related to immutable essences connected with the existence. In other words, faith becomes existential cement to connect people in a certain vision of peaceful coexistence. This is what we are working at the moment in Iraq. We have a workshop next month training the Iraqi youths to become the leaders of tolerance and intra-faith conflict resolution. And we have developed modules. The modules are practical training of the youth leaders to increase more and more participation in the tolerant attitude that we need towards one another. As you know, Iraq has Sunni, Shia population, also there are Christians, also there are Yazidis and other communities, and how we help them to build the situation that is peace building and nation building. That's what we have been training, because you need to speak to the people from what I call the cultural point of view so that they can be participant in it. You cannot introduce Western paradigm all of a sudden out of blue in the Muslim parts of the world where there is conflict. We also work between Palestinians and the Jews. We were sent by United Nations to build bridges between Christians, Jews and Muslims. Muslim, that is Arab Palestinians, refused to participate because they were not treated equally. So the first condition in dialogical treatment is that I should recognize your humanity as equal to my humanity. And that has not been, in the post-colonial age, we have been fighting that. Because colonial psychology was very different. Imperialist psychology was different. Now the psychology is changing, but there are certain modes which have not changed. And I think that's where you find United Nations is still harping on the same ideas that were prevalent in the colonial age. And this is what Muslim consciousness is fighting back. So in conflict resolution, what we have done is that we have introduced two paradigms. A paradigm that is solely based on native sources, native value system, native culture. How are they solving their issues? And then we bring what we call from the modern day conflict resolution. We have an Institute of Conflict Resolution in George Mason University. Or we have our colleagues who are working day and night to bring, resolutions in the Syria, Iraq conflict and other places. But what we have been quite, I think, very consciously studying about is that medical ethics has universal principles that are usable and that are applicable in the situation that we are talking about. Oh, the next one. Okay, so let's look at the guiding principles. I'm talking about Islam at the moment so that I can connect with my audience here in Indonesia. And if I do that, it also helps me to understand the secular bioethics. Because secular bioethics is very much based on what we call human individual ability to resolve any ethical issues. So when I'm confronted as a physician in clinical ethics about issues that I need to resolve, I can do it through my own rational capabilities as much as my experience. So my culture, my experience, all these are helpful in me to allow me to solve the conflicts within the hospital situation, within the clinical situation. And I think that I take that paradigm and move on. In the paradigm that I move on, I find that the dichotomy is between religious and secular actually is non-existent in Abrahamic traditions. In Abrahamic tradition, that means in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is no such dichotomy. There's no such separation between the two. Rather, two are talking to one another in order to solve the problems that are human issues and human problems. So, professional ethics in the Islamic paradigm, in the religious local paradigm, as I call it, native paradigm, is geared towards protecting individuals' well-being within familial and communal context. That means there's a larger context in which I function as the provider of some kind of paradigmatic case study. How do I solve that problem? And those problems are solved based on certain principles and certain rules. So, all right, so I want to draw your attention to the last point, which is the ethics. If religion is the source of human interconnections in relationships, ethics actually maintains professional and interpersonal responsibilities and responsiveness. What am I supposed to do when I confront a situation in which I find that I don't agree with the colleagues, I don't agree with the people with whom I have a conflict? What do I do? How do I resolve that? And I think that brings me to a very important search, that where is exactly this paradigm that is located? If I can locate that paradigm in Islamic biomedical ethics, then I can also enlarge it to be inclusive. So here it is. Human relationship is at the center of all ethical issues. The Prophet of Islam was asked, what is Islam all about? And he said it quite interestingly, الطاعة للخالق والشفقة للمخلوق. Obedience to God and kindness towards all creatures of God. Kindness towards all creatures of God is very inclusive. You're also supposed to be taking care of the environment. You're also supposed to take care of everything around you in which you find involved in one way or another. And therefore, I think that in Islamic ethics, unlike the secular ethics, autonomy is secondary to relationship with one's family and community. This is true of the Eastern societies in general. Communities do matter. Individualism is not a paramount quality of individuals to be left on their own. That's a Western paradigm that is being challenged with the new advancements in the cultural studies today. That Enlightenment ideas, Kantian idea of autonomy is not workable in the situation in which we find today ourselves. So that's something that is given. So virtues like justice and temperance are central to moral development. They're also part of the community development. They're also part of the conflict resolution that we are now working on practically with the people in Iraq who are not willing to talk to one another. How exactly do we create a dialogue? What is needed? Temperance is needed. The idea of justice is needed. How we develop that idea in that kind of situation. In other words, what we have been talking about, even in secular societies, whether we like it or not, ethics is integral to religion. Religion, in the sense today now we are developing a new paradigm where ethics and law are part of each other rather than two separate disciplines. Because Muslim ulama are always separating the ethics. And therefore, in their decision, you don't see any moral discussions. You don't see any ethical discussions. What we are now talking about is that ethical decisions are extremely important for the decision making in the larger communities of the nation state. So, in the nation state, we are in need of the paradigm that can be universal enough to create what we call the sources of conflict resolution. So what we have been generating now is the module. And I just want to speak about module in few sentences so that I can end there will be a lot of questions from you and I would really like to hear from you. That my thesis is built upon the combination of native paradigm and the secular paradigm, which are together concerned with improving human relationships. Human relationship is at the heart of human religiosity. Again, I'm citing the hadith of the Prophet, and I'm sure my colleagues here in Indonesia are very familiar that the Prophet said, Al-Islamu asharatu ashab. Islam is made of 10 parts. 1/10 belongs to God, 9/10 belongs to humanity. How I deal with you as a human being is far more important than how I deal with God. Because what God demands from me is 1/10 of the totality of religion. What we are demanding from each other is 9/10 of the religion. In other words, there are values in religion that are actually supporting the idea that if we are not concerned about human dignity, if we are not concerned about human beings, then we are failing in our obligation as religious people. In other words, what is missing today, for example, we are talking in the age of ISIS. We are talking in the age of terrorism. We are talking when global well-being is being threatened by few individuals who take religion in their hands and they want to kill and they want to destroy. And that's where we come in providing with what we call the ethical guidelines of how to build a community. What are the resources in our hands that we can do it? And I think one of the most important ideas in the Shia-Sunni relationship that we have been able to provide is a bioethical principle of no harm, no harassment. La darar wa la dirar fil Islam. The Prophet taught very clearly that you should not cause harm to anyone. Nor should you reciprocate harm with harm. If somebody harms you, then you talk about forgiveness rather than causing the harm. And that's what we need in the intercommunal relationship. Today, Shia Sunni are the victims of their history. They are victims of the politics of the region. So whether it is Saudi Arabia, or whether it is Iran or Pakistan or any other part of the world, where Shia Sunni are at odds with one another, we find that they have forgotten a very important principle of no harm, no harassment. La darar wa la dirar fil Islam. And the Prophet taught it looking at the situation in which universal human needs are always to live in peace. In fact, the Quran would remind us that people don't like to fight. People don't like to engage in killing until they are forced to do so. Now, what is it that makes them forced to do so? When injustices are perpetrated at the state level, at the local level, at the regional level. When that happens, then the society is unstable. And that's where a biomedical ethics principle of promoting the good, the well-being of the patient, that's what beneficence is all about. Maleficence is, non-maleficence is that you are trying to do away with anything that would cause harm to the patient. It's not only the patient. What medical profession is teaching us is that it is human science. It is concerned with humanity. Therefore, when you are in the healthcare institution, there is no discrimination. No discrimination is allowed. Because that would be against the biomedical ethics principles in medical practice or medical, research. In other words, medical practice is built on preservation of the dignity of a patient, empowering the patient for taking decisions that are good for the patient. Therefore, we are talking about it. We are moving in the 70s, 1970s in North America. That's how bioethics began. Empowerment of the patient, of the private individual. What they can do in order to stop the doctors to act like God on decision making about their health, about their relationship with their family. And I think we have moved, in the last 40 years, we have come to empower the individual patient. But the principle has been very clear: beneficence, non-beneficence. Also the principle of justice. Not so much autonomy, because in the worldwide cultures there is more communitarian ethics. Communities are working together. And therefore it's very different than the Western understanding of individualism. I come first, and I am the one whose interest must be protected at the level. If there's a conflict with the community or the group, I come first. Whereas we are talking in the culture where groups and communities are important, and how they talk to one another and how they support one another. In other words, my thesis today is that we can use the principles and rules in bioethics, the way it has been developed by Professor James Childress and Beauchamp. And they have worked out the principles of bioethics. They are talking about the secular society, but they also are talking about the rules and the principles that apply across cultures. Like human rights, bioethics is also transnational. Since it is transnational, it can talk to the people in different nations, and they can help each other to understand what exactly is involved to preserve the human relationships, whether it is in the hospitals, hospices, communities, nations or regions. That's the goal of bioethics, and that's the goal of conflict resolution. Thank you very much.
So, Sachedina, very interesting lecture this morning. We have still 40 minutes for question and answer. So I offer to participants, if you want any question to Professor Sachedina, please raise your hand, state your name. Okay, one, and then second, Rafi Chandra Murthy. Third, Professor Agus Provianto. The first one is from behind, please. Yeah. State your name and where you come from.
I would like to address my question to Professor Abdulaziz. It's very interesting to know that you finally stated that ethics are very related to religion, whatever religion it is. But I used to read somewhere in the internet that religion is the cause of problems, many problems in this world. If we want to explain about their accused by bioethics, I don't think that they will understand about that. So how do you think we can explain to them in a very in such common explanation? Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi.
It might seem very far-fetched to regard bioethics as a source or as a partner in peace building. But if bioethics is, in a way, concerned in improving relationships between the physician and the patient, between the hospital and the patients, all these are part of relational dimension of healthcare ethics, then we can actually extract a paradigm from the bioethics to apply it to the peace studies, which are actually seeking better principles than simply, we have a very important principle in peace building about victimhood, how the victimizer must accept the responsibility of having caused, the victims all the harm that they have done, whether it is historical or in the recent socio-economic context. I think that if we can extend that and move to the larger social needs, then I do see that bioethics can really generate a paradigm that can be plugged into rather than function as a whole for the peace building in the society. Because one of the very important issues in bioethics is justice. How we take care of the poor, how we take care of the needy. Also, there is gender discrimination in the hospitals. We have found that the women patients are not given the same importance sometimes in other cultures than the men patients are. So you have all these, different forms of discriminations which we are fighting in the hospital situation, in the healthcare institutions. Those can be enlarged because one of the basic foundation of patient treatment is the dignity of the patient. There's a human dignity of the patient, and that dignity is in vulnerable condition when the patient is sick. And that's what we are fighting against. And that also in generality in the human society, I discriminate such and such person because he or she happens to be different than I am. But if I were taught to respect the dignity of that person, then I would stop being as intolerant and nasty as I am. So I think those are the things. Ethics in general can speak to one another.
Second question from Dr. Rafi Chandramurthy, please.
Is from Malaysia. Okay, thank you for a very interesting presentation, Dr. Aziz. You mentioned a few, or rather in your presentation, by the way, I'm Ravi, I'm from University Kebangsaan Malaysia, which is National University of Malaysia, in Malaysia. And you mentioned certain concepts. One of the concepts that you used was actually circular bioethics in your presentation. Now, if you could elaborate further, what do you mean by circular bioethics? The reason for me asking this question is sometimes in my a decade-long association with Darul Mesa and the Bioethics Association, we have a tendency to put nomenclature to the words bioethics, religiosity to bioethics, like you have Islamic bioethics or Christian bioethics. To my mind, that is wrong. It is Islamic ethics. Bioethics itself has its own, own discourse, academic discourse. Truly, bioethics is generated from Christianity, number one. Primarily, one of the reasons that bioethics is still alive is because of some of the religious ethics are unable to address those issues where bioethics are able to address. Even Muslim countries are also embracing bioethics. Indonesia have a bioethics council, Malaysia have a bioethics council and all that. So how do you think, if at all there is such a term which is applicable, how do you think that secularism in bioethics can reconcile with religiosity in bioethics? Thank you.
I think it's a very important question, and I'm grateful that you asked that question, because there is a debate and tension that is involved. I must admit that when we do make a distinction between secular and religiously informed bioethics, that would be a better term than saying Islamic ethics. I would say Islamic value informing the bioethics in the hospital situation. I think that what we are looking for is, we're looking for the two kinds of discourse that are prevalent in the academia today. In North America, where I taught, where I teach, especially in West Virginia, we had a professor of Jewish bioethics, we had a professor of Christian bioethics, and I'm a newcomer. I'm a newcomer because as one Islamic studies professor, you are supposed to teach business ethics, war ethics, and biomedical ethics. You are supposed to teach everything. So in America, that would not be the case with Christian studies or Jewish studies, but with Islamic studies, that's what it is, because there's only one man show, so to speak. I do submit that there are, if I use a discourse that is secular, then I'm somehow submitting to the academic requirement of separating my faith from what I deal with at the university level, at the academic level. What happens is that bioethics deals with the real people. It's not an academic discipline. It has now been adopted as an academic discipline. Therefore, academic discourse about bioethics is a newcomer. In the last 40 years, we now find that there is a separate discipline known as bioethics. Whereas what we need to pay attention to is that human decisions about end of life, human decisions about the future generation, human decisions about abortion, about organ donation, are culturally and religiously informed. What does my tradition say about abortion? Clinical abortion, clinically induced abortion might have a different take, and that's very secularly informed, because I do understand that the healthcare institutions are very agnostic. They do not portray or support any religious views. You might have a chapel in the hospital where people can come and pray if they find their patients are sleeping in the hospital, but there is no such effort being done to address the issues that are necessarily informed by the culture of the people. Now, Buddhists, for example, my fellow Buddhist chaplain is taking care of the Buddhist patients, and there are Buddhist cultural sensibilities in the Tibetan Buddhism community in North America. So we as secular teachers in the university were oblivious for a long time, not paying attention to the religiously informed ideas about human dignity, about human suffering, Why suffering? Why me? Why not that? And I think all these things are somehow generating the need for religiously based bioethics to address issues that are important. Otherwise, you're right, in academia, that's what we do. And secular bioethics simply is very confident about its decision making. It's utilitarian. It is, based on certain rules, as Jim Childress would teach. Others would deny that it is casuistic in methodology. You are making decisions depending on what your conscience is telling you. All these things are there, and yet I think there are also religious communities, religious patients who need answers from the religious traditions. What is it teaching them? Therefore we say, I would say in a very humble way that if you say that religious bioethics makes no sense, then I would retort by saying that no, in that case you are not taking people's lives existentially as important. You are simply talking about academic discipline and not worried about the real lives of the people. Anthropology of medicine is teaching us that people are important. What they think about issues are important. What they think about suffering is important. And therefore we cannot ignore them. Not that we are capable of really bringing about a kind of a secular tinge to it, which is more tolerant, which is more universal. But also religious ideas are quite universal in their own ways.
Thank you.
Okay, and then Prof. Agus Purodianta, please.
Thank you. It's very interesting lecture from Professor Abdulaziz. My question is, when we deal with the bioethical issues, for example, in the medical context, we consider it to use the bioethical principle as a middle principle. While you are in the lecture said that ethics is integrated with the religion. So my question is it true that religion are like giving more strict direction to us, especially when we should balance among the principle? It is like similar with we should have to choose the best prima facie among the principles who have very, very real in the context. Is it right that Islamic bioethics is like a balancing the principles of the contextuality of the problem? We can decide, for example, for such kind of ethical decision making for the solving the cases, for example. And if we relate it with the five principle of Islamic law, for example, it is a little bit connected or not. For example, if such cases is forbidden, and then we should go simplify with the we should apply with non-maleficence principle, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. These are very important questions. It allows me to somehow clarify many issues that are connected with this. The whole problem in Islamic studies is, until now, we have been teaching Islamic ethics as virtue ethics, which is very much Aristotelian. I have no problem with it, but it doesn't allow you to develop what we call moral reasoning, which is comparable to legal reasoning, to make the decisions that are applicable. The problem is that the Sharia or the religious law is very much geared towards using the text as the main source of its credible decision making. So if you're making a decision about anything, you need to cite the Quran, you need to cite the Hadith literature, that is the Sunnah, and you need to provide that kind of credibility to what you are saying. And that credibility comes to you only when you know your religious sources. But there's one problem there. Religious sources never discusses istidlal al-akhlaqi. It doesn't discuss the moral reasoning. Imagine, I'm an old man who gets, I'm sorry for this example, but it's a real example, by the way. It happens in the universities. I fell in love with a young woman in the university. And as a Muslim, I have a wife at home. Who was my real life partner? She spent 40, 50 years with me. I fell in love with this young girl and I said, I want to get married with her. The Sharia says, as long as you do the aqd, it's okay. It never raises a moral question. Is it right for you to fall in love with a young girl when you have your wife of 50 years at home waiting for you? Come on. There's a moral problem here. But the Sharia doesn't deal with it. Although it claims that it is integral to its decision making, I am clearly now talking to the ulama and saying to them, where is your ethical sensibility? I have wronged my wife who was at home. I was in the university, professor, falling in love with my student, getting married with her, and I say, this is Sharia is allowing me to get married with another woman. But that's wrong. That's ethically unacceptable. How can I treat my wife like that? You know, what I'm suggesting here is that the level of engagement in the religious ethics, the way it is now being proclaimed, is very minimal. Most of the decisions are halal and haram, permissible, non-permissible. They don't say why it is permissible, why it is not permissible. In other words, they never teach you how to make sense of the decision that you are making. This is where bioethics can teach the ulama. I'm being very arrogant here. We can teach the ulama how to think about issues that for example, abortion, they say only if the life of the mother is in danger, then abortion is allowed. Imam Shafi'i and others, they say, no, wait a minute. A woman has 5 children, she doesn't want any more children. Is it a good reason for her to say, I don't want my 6th child, I'm tired of 5 children, 5 pregnancies? Imam Shafi'i would say, she has a good reason. She will go crazy if the 6th one comes. While a man might say, okay, let her 6, I want 6, Woman can say, no, I don't want the child. I don't want the 6th one. Now, here there is a moral reasoning available, because it is traumatic for a woman to have 5 children whom she can't take care of and now be pregnant with the 6th one. This is injustice, this is unfair to a woman, because man doesn't become pregnant, he can't even experience what a woman goes through. What the ethics teaches man is that you better put yourself in the position of a woman and think what she goes through. Then you will understand the problem of a woman, what she is experiencing. In other words, ethics is empowering human beings, men and women both, to think about issues which the Sharia says, no, you are a woman, you keep quiet. You don't talk back. You are supposed to be obedient. In other words, the 2 kinds of discourse are in disagreement. There's a lot of tension because I teach the ulama. In South Africa, the government called us and they said, these South African Muslims are recipients of the organ donation, but they don't donate. So we said, why not? Well, their imams are saying they should not be donating organs because our bodies belong to God. So we went, me and Dr. Ibrahim Musa, 2 of us, we had a workshop for the imams to teach them that it's okay to donate. It's not good to be only the recipient. You should also donate. And it took us 3 days to teach the imams, but we were highly successful because we used religious texts to tell them that your decision of not allowing Muslims to donate, whereas you allow them to receive, is wrong, morally unacceptable. You must also give as much as you receive. In other words, it's amazing what the religion and religious law really, if it is expanded, what it tells us.
We still have 7 minutes left, so only one question, please. Yeah. Two.
Okay, thank you very much. I met this the vice president of the association for the last time, maybe. But anyway, I'm Sachedina Lee from Taiwan, AUSN. Now, I admire very much your speech and the deep concern about human relationships and your passion for religious feeling, kind of feeling. But I would like to add a little further ideas about the kind of inclusion with others in this world. Ethics is by all means some kind of human relationship, human reactions. It will never be just one by oneself alone. Anyway, sometimes religion may be you just related to God, to their transcendence. But I think ethics and bioethics obviously is something concern our lives, interaction with human life, you know, very often beyond human species. Now my idea is that please consider a little more about universal kind of inclusion. I think everybody has different kinds of religion, and I don't think we should assume at this point that any one religion is supreme to others. Well, for me, very often the religious figures, Jesus, Buddha, and our Confucius, when they go deep enough in their religions or ethical kind of thinking or practice, they always have the kind of universal love, universal inclusion of all people, even all species on earth. So what I mean is, why we are so much conflicts and violence around, very often because we are too exclusive. We exclude others, other human beings, other species, and even family members. I think that's the major problem. And I think, let us return back to earth. Ethics, bioethics, is what we are living for in our life. That's down to our earth. And I think everybody should be allowed to have the kind of transcendence by his or her own ethical deeds, ethical actions. I think this is very important for us to consider, to have a kind of universal bioethics, maybe universal ethics.
Excuse me, sir. So what you really, what the question really? What your question really?
Yes, sir.
Question? What your question?
No question, just reflection.
My question is, please try to be more inclusive in our bioethical and ethical thinking.
Yeah, okay. If I understood your comments and the question, if I understood correctly, in our search for interfaith relations, interfaith relations, human relations, we found theology very unhelpful. We could not build a theology of the common understanding. Theology was always converted, was always thought about the community within itself. exclusive theologies. But when we came to ethics, we had a sense in which we could discuss the humanness of the issues, and we could connect the other human being inclusively in our relationship. So in United Nations, for example, when we talk about Human Rights Commission, we are always confronted with what we call the local cultures, denying inclusivity. They are not inclusive even of their own people. So ethics is weak, actually. And I think that what we are now shifting in our general education is, more and more we are talking about the inclusive nature of the religious discourse, which is not very easy to convince when the religious scholars are totally against it. Because the religious scholars in most of the traditions, my Christian colleagues, my Muslim colleagues, they all say, salvation is mine. I am going to be saved, you are not going to be saved. Unless you become like me, you can't. In other words, it's exclusive. And today in the world, part of the conflicts are very much generated by exclusive ideas of religious communities. So if I understood you correctly, there is a hope for inclusive language if we make ethics the center and not theology the center of our debates and of our deliberations. The more we talk about the theology, the more we are going to divide people. Even the Shia-Sunni divide is very much theological. It's political, it's theological. But if you bring them on an ethical level, they are willing to talk to one another. And that's what I think, if I understood you correctly, inclusiveness has to be ethical or bioethicists or business ethics. Imagine business ethics 20, 30 years ago. If you told a businessman that there is ethics, what do you mean by ethics? I'm supposed to produce wealth. I don't care for ethics, you know. But today, after Evron, after so many things that have happened in the world, now we are talking the common language. We're saying ethics must, decide the way our international, corporations are functioning and doing business in the world and, doing everything in the third world countries. All these things are now under the scrutiny of ethics. I don't know how successful it will be, but it started. So that's the only inclusiveness that I can imagine. I'm sure I misunderstood you completely, but if I understood the essence of what you were trying to say, this is my response to you.
No, actually, time is running out, so I would like Professor to have to ask.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a comment on the earlier discussion about defining bioethics and positioning it in relation to religious discourses. I think the word bioethics is being used in several different ways here, and I think it's useful to distinguish between a discourse, which is how you've been characterising religions, and disciplines. And one can think of it, a discourse as something that includes a body of thought and a connection to action, to practical life, exactly as you said in relation to religion. A discipline is something that's much more limited. A discipline has a particular theory of truth or validity, a method of defining a problem domain and so on. Bioethics, the word bioethics is used in both ways. It's used as a discourse within which a practice of dialogue or certain kinds of dialogues occur. It contains a number of disciplines with which people may or may not agree. So the discipline of principalism, to which you referred, is one of them, with which many people, including me, disagrees. I think it's done more harm than good to bioethical discourse. Similarly, the discourses of utilitarianism, deontology and so on are highly partial, local ideas that sometimes apply to bioethics and sometimes don't. I feel it's more useful to think of bioethics as a field within which certain kinds of issues are explored. And that can embrace a range of different practices and multiple disciplines, as Professor Sanato always reminds us. If you think of bioethics as a multidisciplinary discourse, then one is faced with the question of how to position it in relation to other discursive fields, such as the religious ones, which define the terms of the problems and the practices and so on. So I don't know if that's a helpful comment, but I don't think it's inconsistent with what you're putting to us. The question I did want to ask, however, was about the predicament that we face, the ethical predicament that we face in the world, and we face many of them. The one I wanted to focus on was that of religious extremism, especially that is characterised in the Islamic world. For example, the phenomenon of ISIS or extreme religious fundamentalism. That's not to say, of course, that such problems don't exist elsewhere. The election of Donald Trump in the United States has raised the possibility of a new catastrophe that was almost unthinkable a week ago. But specifically, I'd like to understand how, in terms of your theoretical language, you diagnose the problem of Islamic religious extremism. What's gone wrong? And the diagnosis is important because the therapy will follow the diagnosis. So I'm asking, within the discourse of Islamic thought, how do you characterise theoretically this particular problem that the world is facing at the moment?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a huge question, by the way, and you know it's an important, I think, link to understanding the kind of militancy that is growing in the different parts of the Muslim world, and I think I would submit that in my own assessment of the situation, I find that extremism is very much the product of misappropriation of religion under these political autocratic systems that are dominant in the parts of the world that we are dealing with. I do recognize that in the Islamic law and the Sharia, when we deal with the whole question of the jihad or the religiously inspired warfare, there are issues that need to be revisited today in order for the Muslims to understand its irrelevance in the modern nation state existence of the international order. I think that my hunch is that religious extremism is very much inspired by the power struggle that is going on. If you look at the ISIS is, for example, in northern Iraq and northern Syria, is very much the product of Saddam Hussein's era. And the Ba'athi party, the party that was in control for almost 3 to 4 decades. And I think that sometimes religion is just referred to without any clear indications in the religion. I know that, you know, they cite the Quranic verses, kill them wherever you find them, فَقْتُلُوهُمْ حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمْ, wherever you find them, kill them, all the infidels. So there are these verses that are floating, and there are also decisions made. For example, irregular warfare, which you and I call terrorism today, is a justified thing, by the way, in the Islamic law, because it says that people have a right to stand up against an unjust government. An unjust government means, you know, the government that is not bound by the constitution that it proclaimed in the first place, or finds itself not obeying the laws. So in other words, there are justifications for violence in the tradition. And I think Islam is very important to remember that the founder of Islam was also the founder of Islamic civilization, and also laid down the first Islamic, state. In other words, it laid down the rules of engagement, of the craft, statecraft. So we do find that those issues are there and they need to be revisited. In other words, there has not been condemnation of the terrorism or the extremism by the religious leaders in the Muslim world. And the religious leaders, I say, Al-Azhar, Cairo, wherever you go, you have these, big names, Qaradawi, somebody else, they have not condemned it. And I think the indifference of the religious leaders is very much worrisome because it is very unethical stance that they have taken. So even Shia Sunni, debates that are going on, Qaradawi's fatwa that Shia are not even Muslims, would make a very difficult situation in the world in which we are operating. In other words, I don't think I have a very short answer and a convincing one for the explanation of the situation that I find is very unpalatable, academically as well as realistically it is. Sorry about that.
Yeah, because time is running out now. I believe that some of you still want to ask a question. Hopefully that you can discuss with Professor Abdulaziz during the lunch time. So I would like to close the session and thank you very interesting lecture from Professor Sachedina. Thank you very much.